Hi everybody. I'm doing this video for my friend Paula, kind of reviewing a sermon that I did in a class that I took. So we're going to start today by talking about genealogies. Have you ever done a genealogy of your family? I have. Did you find anyone, interesting in your family tree? Or did you maybe find some skeletons in your family tree? Why do you suppose some people get into doing their genealogies? I think it provides connection, importance, and sometimes just documentation. I did a family tree for my husband's family using birth and death records and census records. We thought from using our genealogy, from looking stuff up, that he was about a third Native American. Traced him back to the Monacan tribe, and on paper, looked like he was a third Native American. But then we signed up for, a DNA test, and it showed that he didn't have a drop of Native American blood. Not a drop, which was kind of surprising to us. But it's interesting that what is on paper doesn't always tell a true story. Today we're going to read a genealogy. That doesn't sound probably real exciting to you. I think most people, when they're reading through the Bible, they just kind of skip the genealogies, Some of them are chapters long in the Old Testament, and it doesn't provide really exciting reading most of the time. But we're going to read today the first chapter in the book of Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, the first gospel. So turn to the first page of Matthew and let's set up the background first. And we're going to look at the very first verse 1, chapter 1 of Matthew. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Who's Matthew? You guys probably all know who Matthew is, and I think the first thing people say is, well, he was a disciple of Jesus, of course. He was one of the 12. But who was he before he was one of the 12? He was a tax gatherer, and he was a Jewish tax gatherer. Let me explain a little about how they did taxes then. The elite people, the senators and any of the rich folks, could buy at public auction the right to collect the toll taxes in a given area at a fixed rate for a 5-year period. Whatever was collected beyond the fixed rate was profit. So, of course, they would jack it up as high as they could to take home as much profit as they could. So they would hold the rights to the specific area, and then they would hire people to go collect the taxes because, of course, they weren't going to do that themselves. And so the people who they hired also could jack up the tax prices because anything they brought in above what was being asked for, they could keep. So there was a huge incentive to tax as much as possible. And you had the backing of the Roman government, so people couldn't say no. The Roman army was behind you. So naturally, if you were a Jew collecting money for Rome at a rate that handsomely pads your wallet, you're not going to win any popularity contests among your people. Usually tax collectors were not even allowed in the synagogue. The rabbis wouldn't have anything to do with them. In fact, they were seen as traitors to their people. They were on the same level as prostitutes and Gentiles. So that's Matthew. He was a tax gatherer, i.e. a prostitute or a Gentile. So here's this tax gatherer turned disciple. Okay, got that? He's not high up on the social ladder, let's put it that way. Let's move on. In the book of Matthew, he is addressing the Jewish Christians, people who probably still attend synagogue on Saturdays, people who know the Old Testament backwards and forwards. Matthew, the book of Matthew, is the most Jewish book of the New Testament. He quotes the Old Testament more than any other gospel. It's basically, a continuation. It makes a really nice flow from the Old Testament to the New Testament. This is important because it shows why Matthew starts with a genealogy. He's a Jew. His subject, Jesus, is Jewish, and his audience is Jewish. So he's using a form that they'll understand to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. So Matthew starts at the beginning, and this will get their attention. Let's read, we read verse 1, but let me read again. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, the word son here doesn't mean actual son. It just means that he is a descendant. Because, of course, David is not the actual son of Abraham. He's down 7 generations, or 14 generations. In Luke, there's also a genealogy, if you ever want to go look at it. But that one goes all the way back to Adam. This one only goes back to Abraham. Luke's genealogy may be connecting Jesus, who made Adam. If you look at the book of John, he made everything, to the Jesus who came in the flesh as a man. So that encompasses, God's creation of man to the creation of Jesus as man. In Matthew's genealogy, however, he only goes back to Abraham, where God's covenant began, to Christ, through who the new covenant was given. Now, step back for just a minute and think about this Jewish audience and how they would react to Matthew's announcement that this is Christ's genealogy. Now, they are Christians. They have come to understand that Christ is God. He is the Messiah that was promised. So this is going to prick up their ears, They're going to understand that he's going to show us how this Jesus that we believe in really is the Messiah. He's going to use the Old Testament genealogy to prove it. So this is going to, make them kind of proud, just like sometimes we're proud of our genealogies. He is the line of David. He is in a line from Abraham. This was meant to reassure them that he really is who they've been taught that he is. The people of this culture really looked up to David and Abraham. So even though Jesus was of humble birth, he was descended from Abraham, the father of the faithful, and David, the sweet psalmist. This was some juicy stuff. This was the presentation of the king. So imagine the king, Jesus, steps out for all to see in glowing white robes and a golden crown on his head. The crowd's very pleased that they have proof of who he is. But somewhere back in their brains, they know the whole story of the genealogy isn't always talked about. They already know the skeletons in the closet, but they brush it under the rug. Was David a perfect man? Of course not. He messed up pretty big, as we'll talk about in a little bit, but he always turned back to God. What about Abraham? Was he a perfect man? Of course not, but he was faithful to God. Even when he messed up, he always believed God would come through. So the next verse, verse 2. To Abraham was born Isaac, and to Isaac Jacob, and to Jacob Judah and his brothers. Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and his brothers. Some Bibles translate the birthing process as begat. Some of them say was the father of, or fathered, or brought forth, which I think is funny because really I think of the wife as bringing forth the children, but they don't mention her. The same word is used in every step of this genealogy, begat, 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 because it creates this solid scarlet thread from Abraham to Jesus. The men carry the bloodline in the Jewish tradition. You will notice that they don't usually name the women because they're not the carriers of the Jewish lineage. So, Abraham fathered Isaac. Was Isaac a perfect man? Nope. He didn't treat his sons equally. He didn't listen to God's choice. Is his son, Jacob, a perfect man? No. He kind of carried on his father's failure as a father. He treated one son in particular better than the 10 sons who came before him. One of those sons was Judah, who's named here. Who was Judah's better known brother? It's Joseph. Joseph and the coat of many colors. So Judah was the one who the bloodline came down through. Judah was the one who was responsible for selling his brother into slavery, but he's also the one who kept him from being killed. And he also stood up for his little brother Benjamin when he was accused of stealing in Egypt. He said, "Take me, put me in prison, but let him go." So let's read verse 3. And to Judah were born Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and to Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron Ram. This is the first verse. It mentions a woman, Tamar. Who is she according to this verse? Let's look at the verse. She is, so by Tamar, she was the mother of Perez and Terah, and she is married to Judah. But who was she before she married Judah? It doesn't say in here, but if you know the story, I'm going to kind of give it to you real quick here. She was married to Judah's son first, his oldest son, and he was so wicked that God killed him. And so through their law, Judah gave her his second son, and he was also wicked in the sight of God, and God killed him. So here she's gone through two of his sons and still hasn't given birth to a child. And so he's supposed to give his next son. But, I think maybe Judah was thinking at this point, she's the kiss of death, and just didn't want to give up another son. And he was kind of young. So he told her, just wait, go home to your parents, and when he gets old enough, I'll give you to him, okay? Or give him to you. But Judah didn't fulfill his promise. He never gave her his last son. And so she kind of took matters into her own hands. She dressed as a prostitute and tricked Judah into sleeping with her. So they were going to bring her out to stone her when she was found to be pregnant, until she proved that Judah was the father. Similar to another story where a prostitute's going to be stoned, you'll note that the woman was accused, but where are the men? If you know she's in prostitution, then where was the guy? We have talked about several men in Christ's genealogy. We've determined that none of them are perfect. I mean, here's Judah. He thinks he just slept with a prostitute, but they're still held in high esteem. Normally, if women are mentioned at all, they mention, in genealogies, they mention the good women, like Rachel and Sarah and Esther. But the first woman mentioned in Matthew's genealogy was not someone held in high esteem. She tricked her father-in-law into sleeping with her. Why did she do that? Do you know how Judah responded when it was found out that he was the father of her baby? He said, "She is more righteous than I am." Because he had withheld his third son, which he was supposed to give her by law. Tamar also carried another negative stigma with her. She was most likely a Canaanite. Canaanites practiced idolatry, bestiality, homosexuality, incest, adultery, and child sacrifice. But Tamar was, married to a Jew, and she was trying to follow the law of her husband's people, and she was being more obedient. I mean, she might not have been doing it right, but she was trying to follow their laws. So she was actually more obedient than Judah was. Now imagine again that you're standing back with the crowd listening to Matthew. Through these first few men, I think the crowd would have been, fairly pleased with themselves. But how would they react with Tamar's name being mentioned? Why is he going to mention her? Shock, disbelief, embarrassment. They know she's in there. They just don't want to hear about her. But what's the most shocking thing about Tamar? It's that she's a Canaanite. She's a Gentile. At this juncture in the story, it seems that Matthew may be telling his audience more than they were really bargained for. We've already seen that the men mentioned here have flaws, all of them. They're all sinful. If we studied the rest of the men's names in this genealogy, we'd see that some of them were downright wicked, and the only reason God didn't take them out was because of his promise to David to bring the Messiah through his line. So let's look now at the women that Matthew mentions to see if we can find out why he's throwing in these names. Okay, we're going to read verse 4 and 5. And to Ram was born Amminadab, and to Amminadab Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon. And to Salmon was born Boaz by Rahab. Rahab is the next woman mentioned. Where is she from? She's from Jericho, one of the first towns that, Joshua and them came across, that he's supposed to exterminate all of these people. And of course it's in Canaan. They're Canaanites. And as we already saw from Tamar, Canaanites were supposed to be exterminated. They were bad. They did a lot of bad things. What was Rahab's job in particular? She was a prostitute. She was living totally outside of God's law and blessing. So what did she do that blessed her and her family? She saved Joshua's spies that came into Jericho. It's hard to understand why she would do this. She lives in this huge city with these Gentile people. She's Gentile, people all around her. Why would she save them? Why would she put herself at risk? The government would come in and just wipe out her family if they knew what she had done. The only thing we can think is that, of course, these people had heard of the people wandering in the desert, and they knew about the Red Sea parting. They knew that they had escaped Egypt. It happened 40 years before, of course, but I'm sure that travelers coming through the city had told the Canaanites all about these people. And for some reason in her heart, that word took seed in Rahab, and she believed that their God was God. So God saved her from the destruction of Jericho, and she went on to marry an Israelite, Salmon, and lived safely the rest of her life. And she became an ancestor of Christ, a prostitute, an ancestor of Christ. So what do these women have in common so far? They're Gentiles, they're not Israelites, but they're faithful. They're doing the best they can with what they have. And they were all blessed by God. Obviously, they became ancestors of Christ. So again, how do you think Matthew's audience would take notice of Rahab, a prostitute? It's almost like Matthew is presenting the king. Here's the king in his white robes and his crown, and then he's just slinging mud at him, Let's read the rest of verse 5. And to Boaz was born Obed by Ruth, and to Obed, Jesse. So here's another woman, Ruth. Who was she married to first? Naomi. And Naomi and her husband and sons had moved from Bethlehem, where they lived, because they were Jews. They lived in Bethlehem. And they moved to Moab because of a famine. So Ruth is from the Moabites, which are Canaanites, in general, the Canaanites. But the Moabite tribe descended from Lot and his daughters, who had incest. They were cursed by God to the 10th generation. Interestingly enough, Ruth was of the 10th or 11th generation, depending on whether you're counting from Lot or his daughters, 10th or 11th generation. So, how was Ruth redeemed? Well, regardless of her lineage, she was a wonderful daughter-in-law to Naomi. She followed Naomi back to Bethlehem after the deaths of all the men, Naomi's husband and her sons. Of course, one of those was Ruth's husband. She followed her back to Bethlehem and said, "Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." In the end, she married one of Naomi's relatives, Boaz, son of Rahab, so son of a prostitute. Boaz is referred to as a kinsman redeemer. He had the power to redeem Naomi and Ruth because Naomi was family to him, and she was in need of help. Although Ruth did do something kind of odd. She went in and laid at his feet during threshing time. That was kind of odd, but her mother-in-law told her to do it. So besides being a Moabitess, Ruth was a very honorable, faithful woman. God redeemed and blessed her because of her faithfulness. Can you feel the audience's confusion at this point? Can you feel they're just maybe getting a little rankled at Matthew's insistence of using the not so great examples of women in Jesus' genealogy? But why has Matthew mentioned Ruth? What does she have in common with the other women? I mean, she's obviously more righteous. She's a good person. She really didn't do anything bad. But she does have something in common. She's a Gentile. And she had faith in God. Both Ruth and Tamar were using the levirate marriage law, where, if your husband dies before you have kids, the son needs to marry you or a relative to provide a child for him. Let's look at verse 6. And to Jesse was born David the king, and to David was born Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. Matthew doesn't even say her name, just her who had been the wife of Uriah. Some say it seems as if he is intentionally pointing out her sin, but I believe that this is Matthew's way of pointing out that she's a Gentile. Finish this title, Uriah the blank. Do you know it? What tribe was he from? Uriah the blank. He was a Hittite. Uriah the Hittite. According to some historical documents, Uriah was possibly from the royal line, the last prince of the Canaanite tribe. So, what is this woman's name who was married to Uriah? I think most of you know this is Bathsheba. What was her sin? Adultery. Some say, that she wasn't responsible, that the king came to her door, and who was she to say no? But others would say, she bathed on the roof for David to see her, and she was trying to entice him. But in the end, it doesn't really matter. They both did the deed. They both are responsible for the sin. And to make matters worse, David tried to trick Uriah, and when that didn't work, he had him killed in battle. So he had somebody killed so that he could have Bathsheba. There is one last woman mentioned in Matthew's reading of Jesus' genealogy. And I'm going to skip reading the rest of this just for time's sake. But in verse 16, and this is the end of the genealogy, and to Jacob was born Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Does Mary seem to have any similarities to the first four? They are most likely all Gentiles. She's Jewish. She's a virgin. They are not. They've been around the block a few times. We know from our perspective that Mary was an innocent, not sinless, but she was young. She obviously God chose her to be his mom, so I think she had to be a pretty cool person, pretty good person. But people at the time didn't know that. They thought that she had gotten pregnant before she was married. They thought that she was kind of on the low side of the totem pole. But they did accept that Jesus was Joseph's, but they didn't look kindly on her. Mary and Tamar could have both been stoned for prostitution or for, having sex before marriage, but they were redeemed. And the interesting thing is there that nowhere in Scripture does anyone question Jesus' heritage through Joseph to King David. We can always find similarities between people, but I really think that Matthew is actually using Mary as a contrast to the first four. He's not putting her in the same basket as them. So one more point to round this out before I conclude. Remember who Matthew was. He was a tax gatherer on the same plane as prostitutes and Gentiles. So the thing is, if Matthew had wanted to just show that sinners are welcome in the kingdom, he didn't have to mention any of these women, because there were plenty of men in the genealogy who were rotten to the core. Every one of them had sin in their lives except for Jesus. They were all sinners. So they didn't need to bring these 4 women in to show that God had sinners in his family pool. As a matter of fact, it is pointed out that some of these women in question were considered to be more righteous than the men in their lives. So the fact that they were sinners is a common thread throughout this whole genealogy. Men and women, sinners. So why even add the women? Why bring up the women? Why mention them? What do the first 4 women have in common that none of the men have? They're all Gentiles. Are any of the men Gentiles? Of course not. Because the Messiah had to be from the male bloodline going back to Abraham. The men had to be Jewish. So the only way to include Gentiles in Jesus' ancestry was through the women. Not only that, but when David killed Uriah and took Bathsheba as his wife, David made Jesus not only the King of Jews, but also possibly the Prince of the Gentiles. Just like my husband's bloodline, the genealogy doesn't show the whole story. What's on paper, what men see as a royal bloodline, doesn't show what's in your blood. Matthew weaves a perfect tapestry of Jesus' ancestry. He proves to the Jewish audience that Jesus, the long-awaited Messiah, doesn't belong to just them. He is the Messiah, the Redeemer of all people. Christ's blood was from all people and was shed for all people. And the truth that Matthew presented is this: you don't have to be perfect. You just have to have faith in God. Your character matters more to God than your bloodline. Your obedience matters more. And his blood covers us all. I hope you enjoyed this, Paula. Did this just for you, and I hope you're feeling better. Love you. Bye.